Long before Athens built its marble temples, and long before Rome dreamed of empire, there was an island in the middle of the Mediterranean where people painted their walls with flying dolphins and built palaces that seemed to float above the sea. On that island, they didn't carve great stone kings or boast about their battles in long inscriptions. Instead, they covered their rooms with color, turned their store roofs into gardens, and worshipped a goddess who held snakes in her hands. Later Greeks would whisper legends about them, about a labyrinth, a monster, and a king named Minos. Some would even say that this island was Atlantis. Today, we call them the Minoans. And their story is one of the strangest in ancient history. A civilization that seemed to love beauty more than war, that ruled the sea without walls, and then vanished in a catastrophe we still don't fully understand. When archaeologists first dug into the soil of Crete at the beginning of the 20th century, they were looking for a myth. The British archaeologist Arthur Evans had read Greek stories about a mighty king, Minos, and a maze so complex you could never find your way out. He wondered if there really had been a powerful civilization on Crete long before the age of classical Greece. What he found was not a single palace, but the remains of an entire palatial system. Multiple enormous complexes across the island: Knossos, Phaistos, Malea, Zakros. At Knossos, Evans uncovered thousands of rooms folded around light wells and courtyards, connected by staircases that seemed to loop back on themselves. No wonder later Greeks imagined a labyrinth. Walking through those ruins, you really do feel like you could get lost inside someone else's mind. But what made the biggest impression was not the scale of the palace. It was the art. On the walls, frescoes showed lithe, dark-haired figures leaping over bulls in impossible arcs. Women with bare shoulders and voluminous skirts watching from balconies. Blue dolphins swimming across red walls, and landscapes full of lilies, birds, and waving grasses. Compared to the rigid statues of Egypt or the stern, carved kings of Mesopotamia, Minoan art feels almost modern. There is movement, humor, a sense that these people actually enjoyed being alive. When we look more closely, we start to see just how unusual this civilization was. While other Bronze Age powers covered their hills with heavy fortifications, most Minoan palaces had no defensive walls. Crete itself is a natural fortress in the sea, but even so, the absence of fortifications is striking. It suggests something bold, that the Minoans may have felt safe enough to leave their cities open. Ancient writers later spoke of a thalassocracy, a sea empire, where the Cretans ruled the waves so completely that no one dared attack them. Archaeology lends some weight to that idea. Minoan pottery and luxury goods have been found all across the Aegean and beyond. On the Greek mainland, in the islands, on the coast of Anatolia, in Cyprus, even in Egypt. Instead of marching armies across land, the Minoans seem to have built their power on ships and trade. From Crete, they exported fine pottery, olive oil, maybe wine, and metals. In return, they imported copper from Cyprus, tin from far away, and ideas from every shore they visited. The palaces themselves were like beating hearts of this network. Each had large storage magazines, long rows of sunken jars called pithoi, where grain, oil, and other goods were kept, recorded, and redistributed. This was not a loose collection of villages. It was a coordinated system, managed through writing, accounting, and administration. And yet, another mystery. We still can't read their earliest language. The Minoans used a script we call Linear A, small signs pressed into clay tablets, recording lists and inventories. We know it's a form of writing. We've counted patterns, seen repeated signs that look like words, even recognized numbers and fractions. But the underlying language has not been deciphered. Later, when Greek speakers from the mainland adopted the palace system, they created a related script, Linear B, which has been decoded and turned out to be an early form of Greek. Linear A is older and likely records a language spoken only on Crete before the Greek arrival. With no bilingual inscription, no Rosetta Stone of the sea, the voices of the original Minoans remain silent. So, we're left to read their world instead. When you walk through Knossos today, one thing stands out immediately: light. The palaces are filled with open courtyards, columns painted red and black, and shafts that channel sunlight down to lower levels. Rooms are arranged around these light wells, creating natural ventilation. In an age when most architecture was about weight and solidity, Minoan buildings feel almost airy. Inside, the so-called Queen's Megaron has frescoes of dolphins and flying fish, and a bathroom with an early flushing device, a clay bath and a drain leading outside. This is very different from the grim stone chambers of Near Eastern palaces. We see here a society that invested energy in comfort, beauty, and movement. Even their religion seems less hierarchical and more fluid. We don't see rows of stern gods with animal heads. Instead, we see a recurring figure, a woman holding snakes, standing on rooftops or mountain shrines, often flanked by lions or birds. Some scholars speak of a great goddess linked to nature, fertility, and the cycles of life, served by priestesses, worshipped in caves, on peaks, and in palace courtyards. We have to be careful not to romanticize too much. We simply don't know all the details. But the visual record suggests that women may have had a more visible role in Minoan ritual and public life than in many later societies. Of course, the most famous image of Minoan culture is the bull. On frescoes and seal stones, we see acrobats grasping the horns of charging bulls, vaulting over their backs, and landing lightly on their feet. Whether these scenes show real performances, symbolic myths, or something in between, we can't be sure. But we do know that bulls and horns were central symbols. Carved stone horns, the horns of consecration, decorated palace roofs. Later Greeks turned this imagery into a darker story, a monster with a bull's head, a labyrinth, and young men and women sent as tribute to be devoured. That myth may preserve a distant memory of Minoan power over mainland Greece, a time when Cretan ships dominated the Aegean, and local stories cast them as both fascinating and frightening. Then, quite suddenly in archaeological terms, the story changes. Around the middle of the 2nd millennium BCE, something terrible happened in the Aegean. On the island of Thera, modern Santorini, a volcano erupted with devastating force, one of the largest eruptions in recorded history. It blasted ash high into the atmosphere, collapsed the center of the island into the sea, and likely sent massive waves surging across the region. Minoan ships, harbors, and coastal towns would have been in the direct line of fire. For years afterward, ash may have darkened skies and disrupted climate, hurting agriculture and trade. At several Minoan sites, archaeologists find layers of destruction, followed by rebuilding, then more damage later on. The eruption alone did not erase the Minoans. They struggled, rebuilt, continued, but it seems to have weakened them at precisely the moment when another power was rising to the north, the Mycenaean Greeks. On the mainland, Fortified palaces at Mycenae, Pylos, and Tiryns were growing richer and more militarized. Eventually, Mycenaean influence spilled over to Crete. Linear B tablets appear in the palaces, recording Greek names and Greek gods. Burials show more weapons. Step by step, the original, softer Minoan character gives way to something harsher, more in line with the warrior aristocracy of the mainland. By the end of the Bronze Age, the great palaces of Crete were abandoned or reduced, their frescoes crumbling, their storerooms empty. When classical Greek writers later spoke of Minos and the Labyrinth, they were remembering a world already 1,000 years gone. So what do we do with a civilization like the Minoans? Beautiful, powerful, yet still partly out of reach. We can't hear their voices. We don't know their true names for their gods, their cities, or their own island. What we do see is a pattern that runs through history. A people harnesses trade instead of conquest, builds networks instead of walls, fills its spaces with color and light, trusts the sea more than armies. For a while, it works. For a while, it creates one of the most sophisticated cultures on Earth. Then, nature shifts, neighbors change, and the balance tips. The ruins that remain look like the shell of a dream, rooms open to the sky, staircases that go nowhere, and dolphins still leaping across broken plaster as if nothing ever happened. The Minoans are a reminder that not all lost worlds are gray and grim. Sometimes what we lose are places of joy, societies that danced with bulls, painted their corridors blue, and trusted the sea so completely that they forgot, for a moment, how fragile islands can be. Today, when we look at Crete, we see tourists and villages, ferries and beaches, but under all of that, there is still a ghost empire of color and light. A civilization whose language we cannot read, but whose art speaks instantly across 4,000 years. This was the world of the Minoans, the sea empire behind the myth of Atlantis, and perhaps the most beautiful mystery in the Atlas of the unknown. This was the world before Greece. If you want to travel to the world before Rome, the link is on your screen right now. Like and subscribe to turn the next page to the unknown.